Welcome back, Irish fans, to Breaking Out Brey's Boys podcast. After a few months of hiatus, Notre Dame has finally landed another commitment. Markus Burton has committed to the Irish after receiving an offer earlier this week. Right now, Burton is unranked in the class of 2023, but after a big summer session, Burton is certainly in line to be boosted up in the rankings and will probably be a three-star when 24/7 releases the new rankings. I'm guessing that's where he'll end up based on his offer sheet and his size, but certainly a recruit with a lot of upside for Notre Dame, and I'm going to kind of get into his recruitment, some background on him, his game for sure, and a little bit of how being in South Bend and being a South Bend native is effective for Notre Dame, and then how Burton will affect other players' recruitments and how he kind of fits into this class for Notre Dame. But starting off with some background, Burton was a guy who Notre Dame seemed to always have an eye on, always had presence at his games. Is from Penn High School in South Bend, right under Notre Dame's nose. I believe former assistant Ryan Humphrey's kids went to Penn, or at least one of them went to Penn, and then also played for Mac Irvin Fire on the UIBL circuit, obviously, and had a really nice summer. Really showed out the Kansas City session, which was the fourth UIBL session, 19 points per game, around 3 rebounds, around 3 assists, and around 2 steals. So obviously a really solid showing, and was named third team for that session among some super high-level players at that session, and continued his nice summer into Peach Jam, averaged 13 points per game, almost 14 points per game, 3.16 assists, and out of the 6 games he played, had 3 or more steals. So certainly a nice summer for Marcus Hammond, and really sold the Notre Dame staff that he was a committable player and was a player worth taking. His other offers were App State, Ball State, Miami, Ohio, Drake. So as soon as Notre Dame pulled the trigger on the offer, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that Burton would end up at Notre Dame. And looking back at kind of his recruitment, it was always a guy that Notre Dame liked. Notre Dame always had presence at his games. They like what they saw in the high school season, but I do think they were in wait-and-see mode for essentially that whole time period. They liked what they saw, but they didn't love the competition level, I'm sure, in the NIC, which Blake Wesley and Jared Knesney dominated. Burton didn't quite dominate it, but certainly had a really nice season, really showed what he could do. And then Notre Dame, I think, was in wait-and-see mode with other guards like Aiden Holloway, maybe not Marco Jackson back then, but certainly some other guys who they were targeting were on the board still. Notre Dame was deep in Aiden Holloway's recruitment for a while there, but couldn't end up landing him. And then a lot of other guards came and gone on the board. But Notre Dame kind of wanted to wait and see on that, and they also wanted to see how Burton would react to higher level of competition, because they knew as soon as they offered Burton, it was probably going to be a commitment. And Burton really showed out throughout the summer and proved that he was an offerable player for Notre Dame, and a guy that they could have taken a commit from. Had a really nice summer where he showed he can play with other good players, showed the offensive traits and the offensive skill set translates, and the peskiness defensively that he showed against not that great players was able to show up on the UIBL circuit with all those steals and the way he was able to get into guys, and really helped his recruitment on that end as well. After the Peach Jam, took a visit to Notre Dame, picked up the offer earlier this week. Notre Dame offered, and was pretty much immediately clear that this was the place Burton wanted his recruitment to lend him to, and didn't seem like he was going to wait on more offers, and ended up not waiting on more offers and pulling the trigger just a few days after his Notre Dame visit. So really interesting recruitment, really cool story, and it's cool that Notre Dame can get back into South Bend after this. They landed Demetrius Jackson a while back, Blake Wesley and J.R. Knesney 2 years ago, and obviously now getting Markus Burton. So really good for Notre Dame to get back into South Bend. They've landed the last 3 kind of Division I prospects from South Bend public schools. Well, 2 from public, 1 from private, but the last 3 big-time South Bend prospects, legitimate D1 level prospects from South Bend, Notre Dame has landed, and it's obviously great for marketing. It's great for connecting with the community and a lot of off-court reasons, as well as what Burton can bring on the floor, which is something that I think is a little bit underrated nationally and even locally a little bit. Burton, I think, has a dynamic offensive skill set. The shooting really stands out. He can really shoot off the bounce and the catch from range as well. He's quick. He can create space. He can get to his spots. And there's a little bit of a tenacity when he goes downhill. He can finish over the trees. He can go at guys downhill and seems to love to attack the rim. And for a guy his size, I don't want to keep pulling the size card, but you don't really expect that from a guy who's a little bit of an undersized guard. You don't expect him to love to go downhill and attack like he seems to do. Obviously, is a kind of a shoot first guy, and the shot is really what stands out at you. But you kind of see him go downhill, and pretty impressive. Isn't overly efficient as you would expect from a guy who's primarily shooting threes, a lot of them off the bounce, but he can make something out of nothing. And I really like to see that out of Notre Dame guards. It just makes things a lot easier for their offense to flow if he can kind of create for himself a little bit and get downhill and sometimes even step back and shoot a three or get some separation and shoot a three as well. So I think Burton's offensive skill set, especially his scoring skill set, is something that really lended himself to a Power 5 scholarship. I think the main reason why Notre Dame decided to pull the trigger on the offer is just because of how talented Burton is offensively and how much he can bring offensively. I think the playmaking a bit is also underrated. Mostly I've always viewed him as a shooter, but once I saw him play make a little bit more, I saw some really encouraging reads. I don't think he's the best playmaker Notre Dame's ever had, but he certainly can make some reads. And if he can get downhill, like I think he probably can, and then find shooters, kick it out, and help Notre Dame's offense flow a little bit more, he'll certainly be a valuable guard for Notre Dame. And defensively, the ceiling isn't as high just because of his size, but he does put a ton of effort in on that end, gets a ton of steals, and is really just pesky on that end. I hate using that word because it kind of lends itself to small guards like Jose Alvarado. You don't hear pesky too much about a Blake Wesley, even though I think I did use that about a Blake Wesley or in a Rex Pfluger at some point. But Burton, I think, is a little bit underrated in the playmaking and defending categories. I'm not sure he's the complete player of a J.J. Starling or a Blake Wesley. That's reflected in his star rating a little bit, but I do think he's underrated. Nationally, this is one that didn't get heralded much nationally, and I think it's also a guy who can bring a lot to Notre Dame in about every aspect of the game and even off the floor with the South Bend connection. So really exciting commitment for Notre Dame. Some player comps, I was trying to think of a perfect one, couldn't really think of one. I do see a little bit of Prentice Hub in his game. Also see some Matt Farrell. Matt Farrell, I think, is more of a correct career archetype than Prentice Hub. Matt Farrell was also kind of an under-recruited guy from a hotbed Notre Dame area that Notre Dame ended up landing in. Came into Notre Dame, maybe wasn't a complete product, but ended up turning into a really solid player and a fan favorite at Notre Dame. And I think Burton could certainly have that type of career. I think that's the comparison I maybe like best. In terms of a career, I see a little bit of a mix of Matt Farrell and Prentice Hub on the floor and kind of the archetype of a Carson Edwards type player a little bit. I don't know if he's as quick as Carson Edwards, but he's a guy with a ton of range, kind of a modern basketball point guard who a little bit of a shoot first guy, but can also play make a little bit, can get downhill, and can get to his spots. So I'm not saying he's going to be Carson Edwards. I like to preface that in my comparisons. He's not Carson Edwards. There's differences in their games. Carson Edwards turned out to be a really high-level college basketball player, and I'm not betting on anybody, even a J.J. Starling, having an incredible career in college because you never know what can happen. But Markus Burton, I think, does draw some comparisons to those three, and that's kind of what I saw while watching the tape. I think Burton obviously may not be a five-star type guy, but can be a really effective college basketball player, kind of like Matt Farrell was. And that's the career archetype I kind of like to follow just because of the dynamic offensive skill set that he has. It's a little bit different than Farrell's, but you see a lot of Matt Farrell in his game. You see a lot of Prentice Hub in his offensive game. And the recruiting kind of ranking and him being off the radar a little bit to non-Notre Dame fans kind of lends itself to a Matt Farrell comparison. So really like Markus Burton's game. I'm sure I'll talk about it a lot throughout the next year. Just the way he was able to kind of show out on a national stage at Peach Jam was really encouraging to me. Looked like he belonged, and I'm sure the Notre Dame staff thought that as well after offering him and kind of deciding that he was a guy that they were willing to take. So kind of what it says about the rest of the class is that I still think they would rather have another guard than only have Burton. I think they would love to take on Marco Jackson or an RJ Jones still, if they can convince them to commit and that they'd have a role even with Burton on the roster. Notre Dame is still going to have a ton of open guard spots next year. I think they'd be silly to not try to get another guard just with all the space they have. I obviously want to plug some of those holes with the transfer portal, and I think they'd be silly not to do that as well. But I do think they want to get a little bit more of a mix, probably take one more high school guard, and then hit the portal for the rest of them. I think they'd be remiss to not take another high school guard if they can get one. And if they can't get another high school guard who is at least a somewhat high-level player after recruiting all these type of guys, that is very disappointing. If they can't get a Laurent Rice and RJ Jones and a Marco Jackson, obviously very disappointing based on all the guys they've offered, but it's tough. These guys are heavily recruited, especially the Nike circuit guys, and it's big that Notre Dame was able to get one, and now they have a recruiter kind of built in with Markus Burton. So a lot of open scholarships left. I think a lot of those are going to be filled in the transfer portal, as they should be, but I do think Notre Dame will probably try to get another high school guy. Have been recruiting RJ Jones a little bit, it seems like. Marco Jackson, they're still somewhat in the mix for. Laurent Rice, haven't got an update on him in a while, but I do think it's a guy Anthony Solomon at least likes. And Notre Dame, I'm sure, will try to get another guard, but I think it will try to be more of a portal thing. It is big to have another recruiter on the trail for him, especially a guy who knows the ins and outs of Notre Dame like Markus Burton does. And I think it probably won't carry as much weight as a J.J. Starling trying to recruit, but having a guy who played on the EYBL circuit who has some connections, kind of like maybe their future assistant coach will, is big for Notre Dame. And I do think that Burton helps them in a lot of areas, not just on the floor, but on the recruiting trail, and just kind of relating to the public. Notre Dame has kind of had a divide with South Bend over the years, even though they're in South Bend. And just kind of meshing those two together with J.R. Knesny and Markus Burton on the same team next year will obviously be huge for Notre Dame, just to kind of connect with that community again and have the town invested in Notre Dame basketball again. So solid commitment for Notre Dame. It's not one that is a J.J. Starling level commitment, but it is one that has a ton of upside and is one that I think could end up being big for Notre Dame in a few years. Markus Burton has the potential to be a really solid college basketball player. And I think more offers would have come had he dragged out his recruitment a little bit past Peach Jam, but wanted Notre Dame, and seemed like Notre Dame was always the spot that he wanted to be if Notre Dame wanted him. And Notre Dame decided they wanted him about a week ago after Peach Jam, and Burton, I think, is ecstatic to be a member of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. So thank you guys for watching. We'll certainly keep you guys updated on other recruitments, and thank you guys for watching again. God bless. Peace.